Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center. I'm Claire Haley, Vice President of Special Projects. I am just thrilled to see all of you here tonight for this very special Elson Lecture featuring Kevin Sack in conversation with Dr. Robert Franklin. Tonight, they will be discussing Kevin's new book, Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. I see many of you are already holding this book in your hands, and I'm excited for you to be involved in the conversation tonight. There are those moments in history that stay with us in a profound way, and those moments where even years later, each of us can remember exactly where we were when we heard about whatever it was. And I think for a lot of us, one of those moments, what happened nearly 10 years ago, June 17th, 2015, does not feel like that long ago, when tragedy unfolded at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina. This book, of course, explores that tragedy and that tragic act of violence, but it goes deeper than that. It explores the long and deep history behind this congregation and the religion that defined it. It's a story, yes, of sorrow, but also of resilience and perseverance, not just since 2015, but for many, many decades before that. And so for all of those reasons, I'm very excited for you to experience this conversation tonight. The New York Times book review called the book a masterpiece. It didn't mince words. And I think that you are going to have a profound experience reading it and listening to the conversation. We, of course, are joined by tonight's author, Kevin Sack. He is a journalist for many decades who has written about national affairs. He spent 30 years at the New York Times, but he has also written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times Magazine, and of course, most importantly, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Kevin has been a part of 3 Pulitzer Prize winning journalism teams and was a 2019 Emerson Collective Fellow at New America. We are joined tonight by a wonderful guide for our conversation. I can think of no one better, Dr. Robert M. Franklin. Dr. Franklin is President Emeritus of Morehouse College. I venture to say we have some Morehouse men in the audience tonight. He is also the James T. and Berta R. Laney Professor of Moral Leadership at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He was the first director of the Black Church Studies program at Candler in 1990. He also currently serves as an advisor to the president of Emory today. He served as the director of the Interfaith Religion Department at Chautauqua Institution and a visiting scholar at Stanford University, author of 4 books, holder of 8 honorary degrees. So we are in very good hands tonight for the conversation. And lastly, before we welcome our guests tonight and get started, I do want to take a moment to thank Ambassador and Mrs. Edward Elson. Their support makes these Elson Lectures possible, and they've been empowering really important conversations at Atlanta History Center for several decades now. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kevin Sack and Dr. Robert Franklin.
Well, good evening. Thank you a great deal to the Atlanta History Center, to Sheffield Hill, and the extraordinary staff and team and board here. Thank you, Claire, for that eloquent introduction as we sort of set up and prepare for this important conversation. I also want to thank you, Kevin Sack. It's been a real pleasure to get to know you over the years, mostly through telephonic communication, when occasional requests for comment on some issue, and I'd hear from Kevin and always try to respond. So I was thrilled to learn of this new text and look forward to our conversation this evening. A number of topics I'd like to raise, and then at a certain point we'll be encouraged to open the floor. So we'd love to hear from you. And as Claire mentioned, the fact that this is a book kind of captures an extraordinary threshold moment in American history, a great tragedy that defined what occurred there at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. I suspect that many of you can recall now where you were when you heard that tragic news. And of course, by late evening, most everyone in the country was aware of this terrible tragedy. So we'd like to sort of revisit those events, but also ask questions about how we go forward. I think to start, Kevin, I'd like to ask, journalism is facing a challenged time in our current democracy. And journalism is exceedingly important, I think, to protect and preserve our democracy. So maybe just to learn a bit more about who you are and what you do, why did you select the field and vocation of journalism? What does journalism do that?
Well, I mainly chose it because I think I got a C in organic chemistry in 10th grade, and that ended my medical career, much to my mother's everlasting regret, although she is pleased that the book has finally come out. I think it's the greatest profession in the world. I mean, it's a business where we get paid to learn and to educate ourselves and to inform others. And we get to travel to distant lands. We get to interpret the most important events going on in our world for a broader public. It's just, I can't think of anything more rewarding, and it's been a now rather long but extremely gratifying career for me. As you mentioned, I started at the Constitution. That was in 1980. I was an intern at the Constitution. I got hired there out of the internship and started in 1981. It was the Constitution, not the Journal-Constitution, which shows exactly how long ago it was. And I spent 8 years at the paper. It was an incredible training ground. I got tossed into every kind of story imaginable, and got hired by the Times in 1989, and have been there 30 years with the exception of 5 years in the middle when I was with the Los Angeles Times and then came back to the New York Times. I left the New York Times last October, and needless to say, just an amazingly rewarding experience to work for that paper and to feel what it's like to commit journalism at the highest levels and against international competition.
Well, we commend you. I mean, Pulitzer Prize winner. You've done important work. You've helped to enlighten all of the American public, so we are indebted to you for your past work. Now, you've covered hundreds of topics in the course of your career, but you didn't write a 400-page book about any of those other topics. You did for this topic, this tragedy. Tell us about that decision.
Well, I'd written a lot about race over the course of my career, and as it wound up, a lot about the intersections of race and politics, race and faith, particularly in 2000 when the Times did a project called How Races Lived in America that won one of the Pulitzers that you mentioned. And for that project, I spent 9 months embedded in a Pentecostal church in the Atlanta suburbs in Decatur, the Assembly of God Tabernacle. And just a totally fascinating story to work on, to examine how race played a role within this congregation. It wound up being perfect preparation for this project because I was doing much of the same kind of work and needed to operate with the same types of sensitivities. When the tragedy happened at Emanuel, and I use that phrase somewhat as a euphemism, that is what people at Emanuel call it. That is all they can bring themselves to call it. I responded in a couple of ways, I guess. I mean, as both a native Southerner who had become something of a student of the civil rights movement, and as a journalist who, just as by happenstance, had spent a lot of time in black churches, in and around black churches, I was deeply affected by what happened in Charleston, and there was a real draw to help cover the story and the aftermath. But I also almost instantly got just transfixed by the history of this congregation, which I was Googling literally that night as the news reports were coming over. And so much had happened there before that night, and it was clear that this night was going to be a real marker in America's racial history. That I felt that in this case it really mattered that the killer had targeted this particular place. It doesn't always, but in this case it really had because of the historic import of it. And I think I felt that because of that, the church shouldn't always be known only for what happened on June 17th, 2015, and that people should understand the backstory that made it matter that it had happened there that night. As I learned more about the history of the church, I also started to realize that you could tell this broader story of African American life in Charleston, a city that's as critical to the telling of African American history in this country as any, I would argue. And that you could tell that story all within the confines of this congregation, that it became a narrative vehicle to tell this bigger story. And I thought that had real appeal on a number of levels. One, because of the length of the history, it allowed you to show the connectedness of events and the way that one leader gave way to another or one movement gave way to another in a way that a lot of our history isn't able to do. And there also were these just larger than life figures that coursed through the history of the church, and that I felt I could hang different critical eras of the Black liberation story, Black liberation struggle story on. So there were central characters during enslavement. There was a member of the church who allegedly plotted a massive slave insurrection. The first pastor during Reconstruction wound up being one of the 16 African Americans elected to Congress during Reconstruction as Republicans. The Civil Rights era pastor also was the branch president of the Charleston NAACP. His daughter was one of the first to desegregate the schools. So there were ways to use both the life of the church itself and the life of its leaders to illuminate this 200-year-long saga of progress in our search for racial equity in this country.
I was going to ask you to provide a brief summary of the book, but you just did.
Next question, not so
Next
brief
question,
summary.
right? I remind you the subtitle of this extraordinary text, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. So I love the way you just put it in terms of telling multiple stories and narratives through the lens of what was happening at this particular extraordinary institution. James Joyce had a wonderful quote. People asked him why he always seemed to write about Dublin. He says, I always write about Dublin because if I can get to the heart of that city, I can get to the heart of all the cities in the world. But the universal is found in the particular. Mm-hmm. And I feel that's part of your genius and your craft, Kevin.
Certainly what I intended to do,
Well, outstanding, outstanding. So you produce this extraordinary gift to the world, certainly a gift to the African Methodist Episcopal denomination and to the people of Charleston, and of course to Emanuel. But it's a history book. Some would argue, and perhaps skeptically, Americans have trouble with history. The Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation polled 41,000 Americans, and they found that 27%, this is 41,000 Americans across all 50 states, 27% of them had a basic understanding of American history. But the larger opposite number, just clueless, when was the Constitution written, what year is the Civil War, on and on, just did not know. And I think that your book will be an important a contribution to an important conversation about who we have, how we've come to be who we are.
Hope so.
So I'm hopeful for that. As you were engaged over a 10-year period in collecting sources, interviewing people, I'm just curious, what were some of the most interesting sources, surprises that emerged in that process?
One that sticks out, it's not a source, but it was a discovery, was that I spent a lot of time in the Recorder of Deeds office in downtown Charleston looking for property records from the church's purchase of land, both first in 1818 when it was known as the African Church. This was sort of a predecessor congregation of Emanuel. And then in 1865, after the war, when the current property on Calhoun Street was purchased. And found the deeds. They're in these, thick, handwritten, dusty volumes, just like you would want them to be, in a Recorder of Deeds office. And you leaf through them; they're very heavy. Finally found the right documents, and they're great because not only do they have the details of the real estate transaction, but they've got names, right? They had the names of the original trustees of the church that I could then take and try to figure out, who were these folks that actually started this congregation. But the even more interesting piece was who sold the land in 1865, which was a gentleman named George Alfred Trenholm. And actually, my wife Dina started Googling his name when we saw the document, and quickly discovered that George Alfred Trenholm was the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederate States of America.
Wow.
So this was an incredible reversal of fortunes, right? The story here is that Trenholm, who was a fabulously wealthy Charlestonian with interests in shipping and cotton and banking, a major slaveholder. The war has ended. The Confederate leadership has been arrested and jailed. He's sitting in prison, I believe it was at Fort Frederica near Savannah. And his financial empire is crumbling. And so he needs to generate cash. He sells off this piece of property through an agent. We don't know whether he had any real sense of who it was being sold to, but certainly the agent did. And upon this property is built the first autonomous black religious congregation in the former Confederacy. It's just remarkable. Interesting side note about Trenholm, literary sleuths have literary sleuths suspect that he may have been Margaret Mitchell's model for Rhett Butler.
Uh-huh.
So there's an Atlanta connection.
Indeed, indeed. So as you explore and trace the history of the African church and then Emanuel AME proper, how would you summarize kind of the genius of black church culture from your perspective?
What a great question. Well, I start the book out by talking about how preachers universally like to proclaim that the doors of the church are always open, and that generally we see this as being a welcome, an invitation, an assertion that there's no barrier to joining the body of Christ. But I argue that in the black church it takes on additional meaning, and I think maybe this gets at your question, in that the church is a refuge, and not just from the daily stresses of life, but from the particular ones born of 400 years of enslavement. And you feel that in the style of the preaching, you feel that in the spirit of the congregation, you feel that in the music, you certainly feel that in the liberationist theology that is practiced. And so I think even though the African Methodists are Methodist, and there's virtually no separation between the African Methodist and the United Methodist theologically. There's a real difference in terms of the feel of the churches and the historical place of the churches.
It's fascinating as I think about that line of connection between sort of black and white Methodist churches. I recall, of course, the founder of Methodism got started here and left England, came to southern Georgia with John and Charles Wesley. And it's sort of fascinating because John Wesley was really quite the strong abolitionist during his preaching, as you know, and in fact, at one point urged his church members who owned slaves that to be a good Methodist, you're going to have to take a big step. You're going to have to sell. You're going to have to, change your ways.
Right.
And I just often think about how that church and its history and American church history could have been so different if people had followed that early Wesleyan vision. Well, in any case, so I've asked you about the genius of black church. What did you learn about white churches, white church culture in the South?
Well, honestly, I did spend a lot of time in white churches while reporting this. There's a church that is virtually adjacent to Emanuel, Second Presbyterian. Interestingly, one of the survivors of the Emanuel shooting, Felicia Sanders, cannot bring herself to go back into Emanuel, but she has joined Second Presbyterian next door. And I went one Sunday a few years ago to sort of see her new church environment, and was struck when I walked in the door by a plaque on the wall to the Confederate dead, a memorial to the Confederate dead. So, white churches in a place like Charleston have a legacy to combat, I guess. And many of them have done a remarkable job of that. But obviously, we all know there are real divisions in the mainline white denominations right now over social issues, same-sex marriage in particular. And so, I think those churches have a real identity problem right now, and are struggling to work their way through, and I'm not sure how they come back together.
Yeah. Maybe we can come back to some of that as we think about kind of Dr. King's famous question, the book title of his last book, 1968, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And I think that's a question that sort of haunts us tonight. So forgiveness is in the title of the book. Forgiveness and the words spoken at the bond hearing, I think, radiated throughout the nation and perhaps the world. Talk to us a little about that moment and why that theme is also a word in your title.
Yeah. Well, for those who may not remember, 2 days after the shootings, there was a first court appearance for the accused murderer, and 5 family members trooped up to the microphone. None of them had known that they were even going to be afforded an opportunity to speak when they walked in the courtroom. They also didn't know that it was all going to be televised. But when they got there, the judge said, "Are there any family members here who wish to speak?" And he sort of ran through the families of the victims one by one. And one after the next got up and in one form or another expressed some version of forgiveness toward the killer. And actually there was a 6th family member who had done so the night before, an incredibly impressive young man named Chris Singleton, whose mother was killed in the shooting. She was one of the ministers on the staff of the church, Sharonda Singleton. And there had been a memorial service at the high school where she coached and taught that night. And a British TV reporter sort of shoved a microphone in Chris's face as he was leaving, and he said, "There's nothing but love from our family for right now, and we forgive him for what he's done. Remarkable, right? So I've interviewed Chris, I've interviewed all of the other 5 who forgave at the bond hearing, and 201, they say that they have no idea how these words came out of their mouths. They describe it as a totally mystical experience. It was God talking, they were merely the vessels, and to this day they can't really explain. I mean, Chris himself says, there's no other way for me to explain how I would ever forgive my mother's killer. After speaking to them, interviewing them, and others in the community, I started to conclude that those of us who perceived that the forgiveness expressed over those 2 days toward Dylan Roof as being for Dylan Roof probably misunderstood the intent. And over the course of my research, I interviewed a lot of really smart people, theologians, academics. And one of them was particularly smart, said this: it has the character of a classic defense mechanism, that in order to protect my own sanity and ego, I mustn't live every single day terrorized by this poison and this social evil. It's a way of taking back power by powerless people. It's a power move, a psychological defense move. And in black pulpits, people are urged to be able to do that, but there's a deep empathy for those who cannot, who are not ready. You're urged to do this if you can, but if you cannot, we understand, and God understands, and you cope as you best can with this tragic reality. It's a quest for agency. That's part of what animates folks in the black church. Initiating, taking action, making a difference, claiming power, the power to overcome. So that was Robert Franklin. In July of 2023.
Okay.
And I thought that was incredibly wise and really encapsulated what I was thinking as well, and what I've continued to think, and what I wind up writing in the epilogue of the book was that forgiveness, I think in this context, was its own form of resistance.
Yes.
And that it, in that way, echoed the resistance shown by freedom fighters who had led this church and coursed through this church across its history. That it's the only thing that the victimizer can't take from you, right, is your ability to forgive. And so when they forgive, as you said so eloquently, and I don't know that I quote you, I think I probably just steal from you. It was a reclamation of agency. It was them asserting that they were not going to be re-victimized. I interviewed Anthony Thompson, who was the widower of Myra Thompson, the woman that led the Bible study that night. And the way he put it was that he was not going to allow this guy to be a lifetime partner. And I thought that made a lot of sense.
Yeah. There are a lot of connections between Atlanta and South Africa. We think about Andrew Young, our ambassador and former mayor, about the role that many of our greatest corporations, Delta and Coca-Cola and others, have played in a progressively arguing for change, placing pressure on apartheid South Africa. But one of the things that Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Tutu, who lived here for some time, and I think helped to sort of nurture the spirit of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. He published a book, many of you have seen it, titled "Without Forgiveness, There Is No Future."
Right.
And as I read your words about those interviews and those declarations, I kept hearing Tutu, and I kept hearing this: we're going to have hope, we're going to have a future without this terrible.
And I read the book during while I was writing that chapter.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah. Wow. So you've reflected a lot on the nature of unmerited suffering. King talked a lot about that, of social evil, not just individual, but larger systems that Mr. Roof was a student of, consumer of. So I have a simple question. Why do bad things happen to good people?
That is a simple question, and thanks for asking. Did we have an understanding about this?
Dana told me that would be the curveball.
Exactly,
question.
yeah. You know, it is the essential question, obviously, and I've got a paragraph in the book where I say that I think there were a lot more natural responses to what happened than forgiveness, right? Including, where was God? And I think that's a question that many of the family members of the victims still ask. I mean, I should make it clear that those who forgave did not by any means speak for everybody in the community or everybody in the church or even everybody in their families. There were families that were deeply, permanently divided over the decision by one family member or another to express forgiveness. You know, I can't answer that question. I'm helpless too, but this all I can say is that this case is as stark an example that evil does happen to good people as I can think of. These folks were not perfect people. You know, they all had their failings, and they all had troubles in their lives of one kind or another. But they all felt safe in that space. And they were all people of faith who lived out their faith and who took an active role in both making their lives better and the lives of their community better. And all they did was invite this guy in. You know, he walked in the door, and they gave him a Bible and a study sheet and a chair. So I can't make any more sense of it than you can.
You interviewed, was it 5 survivors or some number?
There were 5 survivors, 3 adults, 2 children. And I interviewed the 3 adult survivors.
It's just remarkable.
And they are all 3 incredible people, all women. Felicia Sanders, Polly Shepard, and the widow of Pastor Pinckney, Jennifer Pinckney. None of them remain in the church. The Pinckneys live in Columbia, so it was not an issue for them. Miss Sanders and Polly Shepard have both gone elsewhere for a variety of reasons, including that they didn't really feel that they got the spiritual care that they craved and the support from the congregation that they needed in the immediate aftermath. Part of it's also just obviously that they have a hard time walking in the building, as any of us would. And so, you know, the building is essentially unchanged from that night. The fellowship hall where the shootings took place is used daily for meetings and lunches, and the pastor's office is down there. I conducted any number of interviews there, and it's a little weird, you know, because you're sitting there talking about this event in the very space where it happened.
Just out of curiosity in this audience, how many of you have visited the Emanuel Church? Been to Charleston? Oh, yeah.
Wow, look at that.
Yes, yes. I certainly urge, we'd maybe love to hear from some of you during the Q&A, but I urge everyone at some point, put that on your bucket list. It's an extraordinary nearby pilgrimage, and so many other rich sites in Charleston that Kevin writes about. And you just see this amazing story of the evolution of the Southern economy and culture and education and religion. And I really think you nailed that brilliantly.
That's a real indication of how life has changed at the church in the last 10 years. The church was in decline at the time that this happened. It was struggling both in terms of membership and finances as well, for the same reason. Gentrification had taken a huge toll on the neighborhood. The church used to be a neighborhood church that people walked to or took a short bus ride to. Now, literally, no members live within walking distance of the church because they've all had to move out to North Charleston or West Ashley, places like that. In their place have been a lot of visitors since 2015. And every Sunday, a good, I would say, third to as much as half of the congregants are visitors, and many of them are white. They come with the best of intentions, and I think are welcome that way, but it has caused tension within the church because there are members who probably certainly unrealistically, just want it to be back the old way. They just want their old church back. And I think it's been a gradual acceptance of the fact that that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. One more question going back in the history, the early years, pre-Emanuel. Talk to us about Denmark Vesey and why every American should know that name and that story, and how that's connected to this Emanuel story.
How many of these Americans know Denmark Vesey? Anybody? That's pretty good.
Yes, excellent. What was that?
Yeah. Now you know about Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey, fascinating story, was an enslaved man who was able to buy his way out of captivity because he hit the lottery. He bought a ticket in a lottery that the Charleston municipality had to raise money for the paving of I guess not paving, but the completion of a street in Charleston. Hits the lottery, negotiates his release with his enslaver, and becomes a free man, a carpenter, very skilled carpenter, and is able to make a decent living at this. In 1822, the authorities uncover a purported slave insurrection plot that they source to Vesey as being the ringleader. And it was uncovered before it matured. There is a now 20 or 30 year long historical debate about whether this plot actually existed in any real way or not. But regardless, the court at the time certainly thought it existed and certainly thought that he was the mastermind behind it. He was one of the very few free people of color that were involved in the plot, and so he was a natural person to point to as being the person who had the resources and the time and the mobility to actually organize a plot. The result of the whole thing is that 35 men were led to the gallows within a period of several weeks in the summer of 1822 in what one historian I talked to considers to be I think it's the largest civilian, the most numerous execution of civilians in a judicial proceeding in American history. And what I concluded after really looking carefully at the trial record, which is a fascinating document, was that it was really the church itself that was on trial as much as any of these individuals. Because when you look at the numbers, 17 of the 35 who were hung were associated in some way with the church, including Vesey. And they were twice as likely to be convicted, sentenced to death, and hung as non-church members. And the record is replete with suggestions that the defendants were actually asked, are you a member of the African church? And witnesses were asked, was he a member of the African church? And that not much more was needed for a conviction. That was pretty much all it took. Vesey has a complicated legacy in Charleston. There are still white folks who consider him to be nothing less than an insurrectionist who was out to murder their forebears. And when several years ago, several decades ago actually, there was finally an effort to recognize him by the city in the form of a portrait being hung in the municipal auditorium. It lasted a couple of days before it was snatched off the wall. So.
Thank you for that. One last observation before I think we're going to transition. Do you have thoughts about the way in which Mr. Roof thought about this massacre in a church, a historic church, as a catalytic event, that it might inspire race war, violence, etc.?
Well,
I think about, well, yeah.
No, go ahead. Well, that was his stated intent. That was the way he put it to the FBI, and proudly so. Yeah. He was captured the next day by sort of an amazing fluke. There were the church's security cameras had film of him pulling out of a parking spot. So they knew the car, they had a license plate, they knew what he looked like, although they didn't have a name at that point. They put out this information sort of overnight. Everyone wakes up to it the next morning. People start calling in, including his own family members who recognize his picture, start calling in, and so the police quickly have a name. And the description of the car is being broadcast over the news shows. There's a woman in North Carolina who's watching Fox and Friends. She was a white Southern Baptist member of the choir, and she really felt strongly about what had happened. I mean, she was deeply affected by it. She's driving to work at the florist shop, and she looks over and sees this car that looks familiar. And she's like, no, it can't be. And she pulls up and she sees the haircut. And she goes, it is. And that's what led to the arrest. She gets on the phone. The cops end up pulling him over. He then has an interview that afternoon with the FBI in which he is more than happy to acknowledge that, yes, he was out to try to incite more racial violence. In his view, white America needed to be awakened to what he perceived as an epidemic of black-on-white crime, and this was his route to alerting the country to this problem. I had some exchanges with him. We exchanged letters while he was on death row, where he still is, in Terre Haute, Indiana. And it was 4 or 5 years ago, so I can't speak to his mindset now, but at that point he was utterly remorseless, justifying his actions, and far more interested in sort of taking jabs at me than in answering any particular questions that I had.
Thank you. Claire.
If you'll raise your hand, I will come to you. There's a lot more of you than one of me, so thank you for your patience. And we'll bring the lights up so we can see everyone better. I'll start back here, and then I'll come up. One behind you, and then I'll go.
Good evening. I'm one of the people that raised my hands. I visited Mother Emanuel about 3 weeks after the incident. Wow. At the time, I was very pregnant with my child. So my question to you is, almost 10 years later, because he has a birthday coming up, what would you say? I remember standing there with my hand on my belly. I was very full because I'd just eaten at Hall's around the corner. And I remember my hand on my belly thinking, I have to leave a better place for you. And unfortunately, it seems that we are going backwards, not forwards. So in your research and in talking to some of the survivors, what is your advice to tell me, to tell my 10-year-old, almost 10-year-old?
Well, I agree with you. I do think we're going backwards. So I'm sorry for that, for your 10-year-old. And something I try to make a point of saying and talking about the book is that I think this history really matters. I think it's history that we all need to know, not necessarily the history of Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, but the history of the struggle for equal rights in this country is something that needs to be central to the narrative of our history. And we are seeing, concerted efforts to diminish it, to erase it, to deny it. I went online a couple of weeks ago and looked at the list of books being banned by the Naval Academy Library. And it's ridiculous. I mean, they've actually reversed course on some of this, supposedly, and some books are going back on the shelf. But the one that sticks with me is the banned book entitled "How to Be Less Stupid About Race." You have to let that sink in for a minute. So I don't know that I've got a lot of encouragement. I hate to say, I guess I would encourage, is it him or her, did you say? Him. I would teach him the lessons of forgiveness that we learned from these congregants. Not only the scriptural imperative, but also the social complexities of it, and which is a complicated thing. I don't think he's ready for it at 10, but I think that's what I've gotten the most out of in terms of the research is coming to understand the meaning of forgiveness in a context like this and what it actually means and doesn't. And I hope that readers of the book come away with a better grasp of that. Mr. Alexander.
Mr. Sack, congratulations. I was another one at the church, and you and Dina gave me a great tour years ago. It's a masterpiece.
Thank
My
you.
question oddly relates to Audible.com and Larry Bird. So in these days, so many people listen to books on Audible. I think back to the late 70s when Magic Johnson and others heard about this Larry Bird playing, and they were in awe, but they were shocked to find out he was white. What was it like? Well, two things. What's it like being the Larry Bird of the literary world right now? And what was it like being a white guy writing this book?
If only I had his jump shot. Thank you for that question, I think. So, I feel like I started this project with a lot of advantages. I thought I had incredible passion for the subject matter. I thought I had really deep, almost endless curiosity for the material. I thought I had a lot of relevant journalism experience, I've written a lot about race and done so in immersive ways and a lot of narrative writing about race. But I had a few obvious disadvantages. One, that I'm not African American, as you so keenly noticed. I didn't grow up in the church or any church. I'm Jewish. I'm not from Charleston, not from South Carolina. So I came at it as a real outsider and was very aware of that from the get-go. And as a result, I hope, approached the task with a lot of humility about everything that I was going to get wrong, everything I wasn't going to know, and more importantly, getting back to Dr. Franklin's questions about the culture of the church, all that I couldn't feel or experience in the way that the people that I was writing about would feel and experience, particularly about this event, obviously. There's no way I could put myself in their shoes. I tried to compensate in the only way that I know how, which was by putting in the work. And I think that's what journalists do. We're always presented with subject matter that is alien to us. We travel to distant lands and try to master the material with enough depth and sophistication to communicate it back to our audiences. So in that way, this wasn't that different to me. But I recognized that there would be questions. The real question that this gets to is who has the right to tell a particular story, right? And I'm just old school enough as a journalist to feel that there shouldn't be restrictions on that anybody can tell the story, but that there's an equal imperative that you have to earn the right to tell the story. So I hope that I did. I mean, I interviewed 200 people. I spent a decade at it. I spent a lot of time at the church asking a lot of stupid questions, and that was sort of liberating. Because of who I was, there really were no dumb questions. And read voluminously, tried to think critically about every word that I wrote, and had a lot of backstops, had great editing from Crown, and almost as important, a lot of outside fact-checking and sensitivity reading. Submitted the manuscript to any number of African-American readers before it was published to make sure that, my language didn't unintentionally offend in any way, and that I had everything as right as I could get it.
Hey, Kevin.
Hello.
Melissa Green, nice to see you.
So good to see you, Ms.
People will
Green.
think you planted people in this audience.
For those who don't know, Melissa Fay Green, who is one of the city's leading literary figures, an amazing writer in her own right, and my dear friend because she blurbed the book, which was incredibly kind.
You ducked Dr. Roberts' question about why bad things happen to good people, and I think the whole book is about that. The way I told him I thought it was like a whodunit. The book opens with this horrific crime, and then people say, how could that have happened here? And you pick that up and say, well, how did that happen here? And you go back to the original sin of white supremacy and slavery. And I think one of the amazing things about the book is how you trace that poison through the centuries, all within Charleston or within South Carolina, until it reaches Dylan Roof, who drank of that poison from some of the sources. And I thought one of the amazing things about the book was how unfortunately familiar the things people were saying in the 17th, 18th, 19th century sound to what people are saying today. But I also would say to your son that there is hope in listening to other people, and you were able to come in as an outsider and really respect the story and convey the story. And it's a beautiful book.
Thank you. And Melissa, thank you for answering the questions better than I could. I appreciate that. If you wouldn't mind coming up and taking the rest of these.
Hi. I grew up AME, and the summer after it happened, we love vacationing in Kiowa. So we made the trip to Emanuel just because of all the horrific happenings. And when we got to the church, you could just feel the emotion around the church. And there was this one woman that came up to us like, what are you doing? And we were like, no, we're just here to pray with you. So my question to you is, have you talked to the new congregation, the future congregation, the bishops that are there, and where do you see this church going in the future?
Yes, I've spoken to the bishops, interviewed a number of bishops, which was took some time to get those interviews, longer than some of the others, but were really useful interviews to talk to them. I think that the church has a real dilemma. As I mentioned, its membership has really suffered because of gentrification. It's aging. Part of the problem is just the style of worship there. It's a very stodgy congregation. It's a very conservative congregation. It's an old congregation. The music is the old-timey hymns. There's no electric guitar. Drums didn't come in that long ago. There's now a trumpeter, and he still gets some, questionable looks. The services go long. We were talking at dinner tonight, 2 hours and 15 minutes often on a Sunday. At minimum, an hour and 45, I would say. So it's been really hard for them to attract younger members. To some extent, it's their own doing. The tragedy has only made that more difficult. Some people have left because they just can't tolerate being in the building where, 9 people that they know and loved were killed 1 floor below where they're sitting. There have been various other tensions that have caused people to leave. And the church has real physical problems. It's a dilapidated building. They're in the middle of a 2-phase fundraising campaign to try to raise the millions they need to do repairs to keep the building upright and in stable condition. There was a point in time just a couple of years ago when the beams and the trusses were so eaten away by termites and water damage that it was no longer safe to occupy the organ loft. That's now been taken care of, but they're still raising money for other purposes. And where I'm going with all this is there are a lot of black churches in downtown Charleston that have faced the same sort of circumstances, but they've got an option. They can leave. They can go out to the suburbs where their membership has moved to. Emanuel can't do that now because it's a shrine as well as a church. And not just a shrine in name, but almost one in reality because it's on the National Register for Historic Places. So they can't leave, and they're going to have to find ways to maintain this dated historic building and to somehow grow a congregation despite the stylistic obstacles to bringing in younger members, and it's just a real dilemma. I'm there a lot of Sundays, and there's always an altar call, and it's almost always unanswered. Almost never does anyone walk up to join the church.
Good evening, Dr.
Hi.
Franklin. Good
evening.
to see you here.
Good
Good evening. Thank you. In responding to what the gentleman said about, did you have a right to write this book? I firmly believe yes. Not just because of the background and the research and the 10 years, but if I wrote it, this is not the audience that would attend talking about the book. And so the book is for white people. Just let's put it plainly. So my question has, and I haven't read it, I will. I want to say it's not for white people, it's for whiteness, right? So as a country, we suffer from that.
Right.
What is the core message, historically and presently, from the Emanuel story in your book to today in LA, today in DC?
Yeah.
What is the connection? What is that role of forgiveness? Because let me say this, I'm Dr. Franklin's student. When this happened, the black seminarians were furious about what does forgiveness mean.
Right.
And the consensus was that those individuals that forgave Dylan Roof did it for their own personal and unique liberation,
That's right.
not for his crime and how he gets to deal with the rest of his life.
Right.
So what is this thing of forgiveness, and how is that our social justice tool for what we're dealing with here and now today? Thank you.
That's a good. I would too. Thank God she didn't write the book. I mean,
Can I,
there's this concept, and Dr. Franklin will know a lot more about it than I do, called cheap grace, right? Which is grace without accountability. And I think there was a lot of concern about that in Charleston after the forgiveness narrative was sort of set in place. I maintain in the book, and I think maybe this goes directly to your question, that there were not all white people, but there were certainly some white people who hoped that those 6 forgivers were speaking for all of black people, right? For all of black America. Needless to say, that was not the case, but I think that a segment of the white population certainly felt the guilt, felt the responsibility for creating the conditions over 400 years that produced the poison that infected this kid. And I think that when the forgiveness was expressed, there was a certain sigh of relief, like, you know, phew, they're okay. They're okay with it. You know, they're all right. And in fact, they weren't in any way okay or all right. So, and in terms of their the direct connection to what's going on now, I guess what so struck me that first night was what that moment said about the persistence of racial violence, even in a post-civil rights age. You know, I had, since college, I'd been studying the movement and was so inspired by it and inspired by its success, right? And this was a kick in the head. You know, we were not in the post-racial America that we spent a day or two talking about after Obama's first election. So I think that really stuck with me, and yeah, we've seen it in the last week.
We have just time for 3 more questions tonight, with apologies for all of your wonderful questions here, and then the gentleman in the middle back. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much for your authenticity. I'm Connie Smith-Lindsay, a member of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, America's Freedom Church. Last year, we celebrated 50 years from the incident in Heritage Sanctuary, where Wayne Chenault came in. In preparing for that 50th anniversary, some of those survivors, the family members, expressed how difficult it was to be back in Heritage Sanctuary talking about that incident as we recalled it. Mm-hmm. I want to know from you as you go through this, because I think our history is a history people love, and they love to write about it. And I want to thank you as a responsible author for doing that.
Thank you.
But when we look at our buildings and they're dilapidated, it's about money. Mm-hmm. If the altar and no one comes, that's not when that's not when the doors of the church are open. Mm-hmm. That's when people need prayer. Mm-hmm. But as someone who has been called to do this work, and I believe you've been called to do this work, what's next for you in helping Mother Emanuel? Mm. How do you strip Kevin down, not as the author, but as the congregation member to help Charleston? Mm. How do you help them?
Well, I guess I have to hope that it happens through the book primarily. You know, I think that there was a hunger within the congregation to learn about itself, and I certainly hope that the book fulfills that need and gives those congregants a real appreciation for everything that had happened before 2015, and an appreciation for how it all led up to 2015 and how it all fits in context. Beyond that, you know, we live in Charleston. I live walking distance from the church. I haven't stopped going because the research is done. I love the feeling of community there, and it's reciprocated. I think I was embraced there with incredible respect, given that I was a white person walking into that church to tell its story at the time I chose to do so. There's a story that 2 of the trustees who have become friends tell about one of the first Sundays that I was there, and I was up in the gallery, and I've got a black canvas work bag that I had with me that's large enough to conceal a handgun. And they're watching me from the choir loft, and they don't really know me at this point. And I unzip the bag, and they sort of breathe a sigh of relief when I take out a laptop, you know. Yeah. So, you know, there was a lot of reason for them to be uncomfortable with me, and they weren't. They could not have been more gracious and more accepting, and I think more committed to the task of telling the story. I think they felt that it was important. So, you know, I plan to continue hanging out and being a part. I am not a member. but I love to visit.
Thank you so much for writing this book. I'm married to a Charlestonian. My name is Ken Jones Snipe, and the Snipes can trace their roots to Charleston all the way to 1618.
Wow.
And they've never left, except for my husband coming to Atlanta. Alfonso Brown, who's a great historian there,
Well, I know
is our
Alfonso.
cousin.
I know Alfonso Brown
I've
quite
been to
well.
weddings, funerals, churches there. My sister-in-law's brother was in the rafters of the church when it happened. He was a maintenance man, and she was supposed to be at that Bible study, but she didn't feel good. I've been to weddings, funerals. I do work in Charleston. The forgiveness piece, Dr. Franklin, who we're family friends, the agency, I think, is very relevant. But Charlestonian African Americans are very different in terms of my limited exposure to people across the diaspora. I've never seen forgiveness like that. Before this, I saw it in my own family. My mother-in-law was a spiritual, transformative forgiver. And so in terms of whether they're forgiving for themselves to be free so that they can let it go, because they say you forgive not for the person that did the wrong to you, but for yourself. I think it differs for African-American Charlestonians depending on their spirituality. But those 6 folks, when they stepped up, I remember seeing that. And I was a criminal defense attorney, so I was the person standing there when the victims would come in and say things, and I never had seen anything like that. I say all that to build a foundation for the question.
Okay.
The question is, did you submit your draft to the family members, and what was their input?
I did not. I was in regular touch with family members. I guess I did submit small sections to particular people. For instance, there's in the epilogue, which is really where I deal with forgiveness, there's a long multi-paragraph quote from a gentleman named Melvin Graham, who was the brother of one of the victims. And I sort of say in introducing the paragraph that I'm kind of giving him the last word on forgiveness, and I do it very specifically because he's one of those that's just got real ambivalence about the forgiveness that was expressed. You know, he gets it, he understands what it was, what it meant for those family members. He can't bring himself to get there, and the other members of his family have not been able to either, and so it's put him in a very awkward position because he's not part of this narrative that his church and his community have become perhaps mistakenly, so known for. So he describes it as a journey. He and his family members are on a path. Doesn't know if he's going to get there before he dies. Working towards it. It's a day-by-day thing, and where he tries to find meaning in what happened is rather than in Christian forgiveness, it's in Christian good works. So, for instance, his sister was a beloved county librarian, and so the family has started an annual book drive to collect books for the local library, and it's been remarkably successful. Thousands and thousands of books contributed, and you do see that among any number of the family members. They've tried to turn their grief into something productive. The Sanders family has an annual fund run that raises money for scholarships. The Pinckney family has a scholarship fund as well. And the church itself dedicates itself to good works in the memory of those who are lost.
And this will be our last question this evening.
Have you received any noteworthy negative criticism of the book? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm happy to say not yet. Would you like to get things started? I really haven't. The response has been just heartwarmingly positive so far. It's been very gratifying. And I want to think that that's a credit both to the power of the story and, I hope, the time that I took to tell it. But no, so far so good.
Kevin, if I could just, as we wrap up, I just wanted to do a shout out to Yabo, one of my former students, doing extraordinary work and helping to cultivate the next generation. Similarly, Connie Lindsay here. Every year we see on the Martin Luther King National Memorial Service a group of young people, multiracial, interfaith. She's helping to cultivate, bring them together, models of hope for the future. I think if Dr. King or Coretta King were here tonight, they would say, we're glad you did this.
No.
And as she said, and glad you did this. It is important in this moment to have journalists who are truth tellers in the spirit of Ida Wells Barnett. Thank you. And I see another who has blessed us in our city, Hank Klibanoff. Hank, rave or stand, because he is telling the truth. About unsolved murders during the civil rights period and before and after, and now uncovering and speaking truth to the world. So thank you for continuing that great
God's work,
tradition.
Hank.
Yeah. Yes.
Please. Do you remember which one? Do you remember whose service?
I want to say maybe she was the 8th victim. She was an older woman.
Mm-hmm.
Member's mother is who she was.
Susie Jackson, maybe? Okay. Or Ethel Lance. Anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was just a real emotional time. We got there and it was warm. We had to stand outside for a while before we were seated. And we were actually seated in the overflow, which was downstairs where the situation occurred.
Yep.
So we're sitting there, and there's this room off to the side, and we're just, our imagination is going everywhere.
Right.
It's like, wonder if that's the room that,
Hmm.
a lot of stuff took place and everything. But one of the members who was, one of the deacons who was trying to direct us as far as, getting seated and everything, one of the things he said is, please be patient with us. This is our 8th funeral in a row.
Yeah.
Really feel the emotion and the tension. And one other thing I'd like to add is that Governor Haley attended all 9 of
Yes, she did. And came back. It's interesting. I was there for a service. I can't remember now whether it was late July or August, but she was there in the front row with her whole family. The cameras were gone. This was not one you do for credit. She was just there to be there, and she, whatever you think of her politics, she was, I think, a real comforter to those family members, and she kept in touch with some of them. And she went to visit Felicia Sanders at her home when the flag came down over the Confederate flag came down over the Capitol. She signed the bill with 9 pins and gave 1 pin to each of the family members. So, but to your point, can you imagine? Can you even start to imagine the trauma for this congregation of those funerals, one after the next? These congregants, they knew all of them, right? They some of them were family members, but they knew the place was small enough and tightly knit enough that everybody knew everybody. So by the exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion by the end of those 2 weeks, it's just unthinkable.
But Pastor Clemente, his service was not at the church.
His service.
2 sentences on what happened there
Yeah.
and Barack Obama's.
Yeah. So his service was at the TD Arena, which was the College of Charleston's basketball arena. It's around the corner from the church, and they decided that the crowd was going to be too large to fit it into the church. It wound up being way too large, even for the arena, and there were screens set up all over town for the overflow folks to watch it. I was incredibly blessed to be in the room. I covered the service for the Times, along with our White House correspondent that day. And, I've got some Times colleagues here, and we'll see if they agree, but I find that the number of times, even when you're working for an organization like the New York Times, that you actually feel like you're witnessing history in real time are relatively few. It just doesn't happen that much. That moment, I knew. When he started to sing, I was on the. There was a press riser in the back of the arena, and I was on it, and my fingers are just sort of flying on my laptop because there was no. The White House had not put out a transcript of the eulogy yet, and I was going to have to file almost immediately after the service ended. So I'm just, trying to catch every word and going crazy. He starts singing, and I just sort of stopped like a hunting dog on alert, And I reached into my pocket to try to find my phone, and eventually got it, and then took another 17 seconds trying to find the video button. So I now have on this phone, the last stanza and a half.
Wow.
Of Amazing Grace. But it really was a remarkable service to witness, and it had a huge effect on the way that I thought about this project going forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your thoughtful questions. And thank you, of course, to tonight's author, Kevin Sack, and our wonderful moderator, Dr. Robert Franklin. We will meet, yes. We will meet all of you out in the lobby for a book signing following this. There are copies of the book for sale. Kevin will be happy to speak with you in the signing line. And we hope to see you back again very soon for another author event or anything else at Atlanta History Center. So thank you all.
Here, here.